The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez limped toward the medical facility. His left leg, still healing from the IED blast that had torn through his unit 3 weeks ago, protested with every step. The shrapnel wounds across his torso had closed, but the deeper wounds remained invisible, carved into his mind like permanent scars. Marcus had been a Navy SEAL for 12 years. He had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, countless missions behind enemy lines, and operations that would never see the light of day in any official report. But nothing had prepared him for that morning in Kandahar when the world exploded around him, taking 2 of his brothers with it and leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. The medical facility buzzed with activity. Wounded warriors from various branches moved through the corridors, each carrying their own invisible burdens alongside their visible injuries. Marcus recognized the look in their eyes because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and was struggling to find their way back to something resembling normal. "Chief Rodriguez?" A voice called from behind the reception desk. The young corpsman barely looked old enough to shave, let alone deal with the psychological wreckage that walked through these doors daily. "Dr. Chen is ready to see you now." Marcus nodded and followed the directions down a sterile hallway lined with motivational posters that felt hollow and meaningless. He had been through this process before. The routine psychological evaluations, the probing questions about his mental state, the careful assessments to determine if he was fit for duty. He knew how to give the right answers, how to project the image of a warrior who was healing properly and ready to return to the fight. But today felt different. Today the weight of pretending felt heavier than his tactical gear ever had. Dr. Chen's office was small but comfortable, designed to put patients at ease. The psychiatrist was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a patient demeanor that had probably been refined through years of dealing with broken soldiers. He gestured for Marcus to take a seat in the leather chair across from his desk. "How are you feeling today, Chief?" Dr. Chen asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "Fine, sir. Ready to get back to my team." The words came automatically, a well-rehearsed response that had served Marcus well in previous sessions. Dr. Chen studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "The physical therapy reports show excellent progress with your leg. The doctors are pleased with how the wounds are healing. But I'm more interested in how you're healing up here." He tapped his temple gently. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm dealing with it, sir. SEALs are trained to adapt and overcome. This is just another obstacle. Tell me about the nightmares." The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had not mentioned the nightmares to anyone, had not written them in any of his self-assessment reports, but Dr. Chen seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade. "I don't know what you mean, sir." Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair. "Marcus, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've worked with SEALs, Marines, Rangers, and every other type of special operations personnel you can imagine. The nightmares always come, sometimes immediately, sometimes months later, but they always come." For a moment, Marcus felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. The nightmares were the worst part. Every night he relived those final moments before the explosion. He could see Jenkins laughing at something stupid Thompson had said. He could smell the dust and diesel fuel in the air. He could feel the oppressive heat beating down on their patrol. And then came the flash, the deafening roar, and the sensation of flying through the air before everything went black. "They were good men," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, they were, and their deaths don't diminish the fact that you're a good man too, a good man who survived something terrible and is now trying to figure out how to live with that survival." Dr. Chen made a note on his pad. "I'm going to recommend that you continue with individual therapy, but I also want to try something different. There's a group therapy session that meets here twice a week. It's specifically for special operations personnel dealing with combat trauma." Marcus immediately shook his head. "I don't think that's necessary, sir. I can handle this on my own." "I'm sure you can, Chief. But sometimes the strongest thing a warrior can do is accept help from fellow warriors who understand what you've been through." The session continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Chen gently probing and Marcus deflecting with practiced ease. But something had shifted during their conversation. For the first time since the explosion, Marcus had acknowledged even briefly that he was struggling. It was a small crack in his armor, but it was enough to let a tiny sliver of light penetrate the darkness he had been living in. As Marcus left Dr. Chen's office, he was handed a schedule for the group therapy sessions. The next one was scheduled for Thursday evening. He folded the paper and shoved it into his pocket, telling himself he probably would not attend. He was a SEAL. He was trained to be stronger than this. But as he walked back across the base, the folded paper seemed to burn in his pocket. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending that he was fine. Maybe it was time to admit that even the strongest warriors sometimes needed help finding their way back home. The sun was setting by the time Marcus reached his temporary quarters. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and pulled out the schedule. Thursday was 2 days away. 2 days to decide if he was brave enough to face his demons in a room full of strangers who might understand them better than anyone else in his life. Outside his window, he could hear the sounds of the base winding down for the evening. Somewhere in the distance, a group of young recruits were running their evening PT, their synchronized footsteps echoing across the compound. Marcus remembered being that young, that certain of his own invincibility. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. He looked down at the schedule again and made a decision that would change everything. Thursday evening arrived faster than Marcus had expected. He stood outside the group therapy room for 10 minutes, his hand hovering over the door handle as he listened to the muffled voices inside. 3 times he started to walk away, and 3 times he forced himself to return. This was harder than any mission he had ever undertaken. When he finally pushed through the door, the conversation stopped. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and Marcus immediately recognized the look they all shared. These were warriors who had been broken and were trying to piece themselves back together. The room felt heavy with unspoken experiences and carefully guarded pain. "Welcome," said a woman's voice from the corner of the room. Marcus turned to see Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the group therapist he had been told about. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold a depth of understanding that surprised him. "Please take a seat wherever you're comfortable." Marcus chose an empty chair near the back of the circle, nodding briefly at the other participants. He recognized some of them from around the base. There was Sergeant Mike Torres, a Marine who had lost his right arm to an RPG blast. Staff Sergeant David Park, an Army Ranger who bore the distinctive scars of a burn victim. The others were less familiar, but their bearing marked them all as special operations personnel. "We were just discussing triggers," Dr. Mitchell continued, settling back into her chair. "The sounds, smells, or situations that can suddenly transport us back to traumatic moments." Mike was sharing how the sound of helicopters affects him now. Sergeant Torres shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's stupid, really. I've been in hundreds of helicopter insertions, but now every time I hear those rotors, I'm back in that courtyard in Fallujah, watching that RPG streak toward us." Several heads nodded around the circle. Marcus found himself relating to the sergeant's words more than he wanted to admit. For him, it was the smell of diesel fuel. Even passing a gas station could send him spiraling back to those final moments with his team. "It's not stupid, Mike," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Trauma affects the brain in very specific ways. These reactions are your mind's way of trying to protect you from perceived threats. Even when you're completely safe." The group continued sharing, and Marcus listened as each person revealed pieces of their private hell. There was a vulnerability in the room that he had never experienced in any military setting. These hardened warriors were allowing themselves to be seen as human, as broken, as something other than the invincible fighting machines they had been trained to be. "What about you, Chief Rodriguez?" Dr. Mitchell's voice pulled Marcus from his observations. "Would you like to share anything about what brought you here?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I'm not really ready to talk yet. I'm just here to listen." "That's perfectly fine. There's no pressure to share until you're ready. Sometimes the most important step is just showing up." The session continued for another hour, with Dr. Mitchell skillfully guiding the conversation and helping participants explore their feelings without pushing too hard. Marcus was impressed by her ability to read the room, to know when to push and when to pull back. There was something about her approach that felt different from his previous therapy experiences. As the group began to wind down, Dr. Mitchell asked if anyone needed individual support before the next session. Most participants shook their heads and began filing out, exchanging quiet words of encouragement with each other. Marcus was surprised by the genuine camaraderie he witnessed. These men had found something here that went beyond their shared trauma. Chief Rodriguez? Dr. Mitchell called as Marcus headed for the door. Could I speak with you for a moment? Marcus stopped and turned back to face her. The room was empty now except for the two of them. Up close, he could see that Dr. Mitchell carried herself with a confidence that spoke of real experience, not just academic training. How did that feel? She asked, gathering her notes from the session. Honestly, uncomfortable, but not as bad as I thought it would be. That's a good start. These men have been meeting for several months now. They've developed a level of trust that takes time to build. Don't feel like you need to match their openness immediately. Marcus nodded, then found himself asking a question that had been nagging at him throughout the session. You seem young to be doing this kind of work. How do you understand what we've been through? For just a moment, something flickered across Dr. Mitchell's face. It was so brief that Marcus almost missed it, but his trained eye caught the micro-expression. Pain, recognition, something personal. I've been working with combat veterans for 5 years, she said, her voice professional and measured. I find that understanding comes from listening, not from personal experience. It was a good answer, but Marcus sensed there was more to it. In his line of work, he had learned to read people, to detect the small tells that revealed hidden truths. Dr. Mitchell was hiding something significant. Will you be back next Tuesday? She asked, changing the subject smoothly. I think so. This was helpful. I'm glad to hear that. Recovery is not a linear process, Chief. There will be good days and bad days. The important thing is to keep showing up, especially on the days when you don't want to. As Marcus walked back to his quarters, he found himself thinking about the evening. The vulnerability he had witnessed in the group was both frightening and somehow liberating. For months, he had been carrying his trauma alone, convinced that admitting weakness would somehow diminish his worth as a SEAL. But seeing these other warriors struggle with similar demons made him feel less isolated, less broken. He also could not stop thinking about Dr. Mitchell. There was something about her that did not quite fit the profile of a typical military therapist. The way she had responded to certain stories, the brief flicker of pain he had seen in her eyes, the careful way she deflected personal questions about her own experience. Marcus had spent his career learning to read people, and his instincts were telling him that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had her own secrets. Back in his room, Marcus pulled out a notebook and began writing. Dr. Chen had suggested journaling as a way to process his thoughts and emotions. For the first time since the explosion, he found himself able to put words to some of what he was feeling. The writing was clumsy and painful, but it was a start. Outside his window, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Marcus could hear the distant sound of jets taking off for night training missions. Once that sound had filled him with excitement and purpose. Now it just reminded him of how far he had fallen from the warrior he used to be. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe with help he could find his way back. Maybe the strongest thing he could do was admit that he needed that help. And maybe, just maybe, there were people who could understand what he was going through and guide him toward healing. The nightmares still came that night, but they felt slightly less overwhelming than before. It was progress, small but real. Thursday evening arrived faster than Marcus had expected. He stood outside the group therapy room for 10 minutes, his hand hovering over the door handle as he listened to the muffled voices inside. 3 times he started to walk away, and 3 times he forced himself to return. This was harder than any mission he had ever undertaken. When he finally pushed through the door, the conversation stopped. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and Marcus immediately recognized the look they all shared. These were warriors who had been broken and were trying to piece themselves back together. The room felt heavy with unspoken experiences and carefully guarded pain. "Welcome," said a woman's voice from the corner of the room. Marcus turned to see Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the group therapist he had been told about. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold a depth of understanding that surprised him. "Please take a seat wherever you're comfortable." Marcus chose an empty chair near the back of the circle, nodding briefly at the other participants. He recognized some of them from around the base. There was Sergeant Mike Torres, a Marine who had lost his right arm to an RPG blast. Staff Sergeant David Park, an Army Ranger who bore the distinctive scars of a burn victim. The others were less familiar, but their bearing marked them all as Special Operations personnel. We were just discussing triggers, Dr. Mitchell continued, settling back into her chair. The sounds, smells, or situations that can suddenly transport us back to traumatic moments. Mike was sharing how the sound of helicopters affects him now. Sergeant Torres shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's stupid, really. I've been in hundreds of helicopter insertions, but now every time I hear those rotors, I'm back in that courtyard in Fallujah, watching that RPG streak toward us. Several heads nodded around the circle. Marcus found himself relating to the sergeant's words more than he wanted to admit. For him, it was the smell of diesel fuel. Even passing a gas station could send him spiraling back to those final moments with his team. It's not stupid, Mike, Dr. Mitchell said gently. Trauma affects the brain in very specific ways. These reactions are your mind's way of trying to protect you from perceived threats. Even when you're completely safe. The group continued sharing, and Marcus listened as each person revealed pieces of their private hell. There was a vulnerability in the room that he had never experienced in any military setting. These hardened warriors were allowing themselves to be seen as human, as broken, as something other than the invincible fighting machines they had been trained to be. What about you, Chief Rodriguez? Dr. Mitchell's voice pulled Marcus from his observations. Would you like to share anything about what brought you here? Marcus felt his throat tighten. I'm not really ready to talk yet. I'm just here to listen. That's perfectly fine. There's no pressure to share until you're ready. Sometimes the most important step is just showing up. The session continued for another hour, with Dr. Mitchell skillfully guiding the conversation and helping participants explore their feelings without pushing too hard. Marcus was impressed by her ability to read the room, to know when to push and when to pull back. There was something about her approach that felt different from his previous therapy experiences. As the group began to wind down, Dr. Mitchell asked if anyone needed individual support before the next session. Most participants shook their heads and began filing out, exchanging quiet words of encouragement with each other. Marcus was surprised by the genuine camaraderie he witnessed. These men had found something here that went beyond their shared trauma. Chief Rodriguez? Dr. Mitchell called as Marcus headed for the door. Could I speak with you for a moment? Marcus stopped and turned back to face her. The room was empty now except for the two of them. Up close, he could see that Dr. Mitchell carried herself with a confidence that spoke of real experience, not just academic training. How did that feel? She asked, gathering her notes from the session. Honestly, uncomfortable, but not as bad as I thought it would be. That's a good start. These men have been meeting for several months now. They've developed a level of trust that takes time to build. Don't feel like you need to match their openness immediately. Marcus nodded, then found himself asking a question that had been nagging at him throughout the session. You seem young to be doing this kind of work. How do you understand what we've been through? For just a moment, something flickered across Dr. Mitchell's face. It was so brief that Marcus almost missed it, but his trained eye caught the micro-expression. Pain, recognition, something personal. I've been working with combat veterans for 5 years, she said, her voice professional and measured. I find that understanding comes from listening, not from personal experience. It was a good answer, but Marcus sensed there was more to it. In his line of work, he had learned to read people, to detect the small tells that revealed hidden truths. Dr. Mitchell was hiding something significant. Will you be back next Tuesday? She asked, changing the subject smoothly. I think so. This was helpful. I'm glad to hear that. Recovery is not a linear process, Chief. There will be good days and bad days. The important thing is to keep showing up, especially on the days when you don't want to. As Marcus walked back to his quarters, he found himself thinking about the evening. The vulnerability he had witnessed in the group was both frightening and somehow liberating. For months, he had been carrying his trauma alone, convinced that admitting weakness would somehow diminish his worth as a SEAL. But seeing these other warriors struggle with similar demons made him feel less isolated, less broken. He also could not stop thinking about Dr. Mitchell. There was something about her that did not quite fit the profile of a typical military therapist. The way she had responded to certain stories, the brief flicker of pain he had seen in her eyes, the careful way she deflected personal questions about her own experience. Marcus had spent his career learning to read people, and his instincts were telling him that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had her own secrets. Back in his room, Marcus pulled out a notebook and began writing. Dr. Chen had suggested journaling as a way to process his thoughts and emotions. For the first time since the explosion, he found himself able to put words to some of what he was feeling. The writing was clumsy and painful, but it was a start. Outside his window, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Marcus could hear the distant sound of jets taking off for night training missions. Once that sound had filled him with excitement and purpose. Now it just reminded him of how far he had fallen from the warrior he used to be. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe with help he could find his way back. Maybe the strongest thing he could do was admit that he needed that help. And maybe, just maybe, there were people who could understand what he was going through and guide him toward healing. The nightmares still came that night, but they felt slightly less overwhelming than before. It was progress, small but real. Dr. Mitchell stood up from her chair and walked to the center of the circle. For a moment, she seemed to shed the professional demeanor that had defined her interactions with the group. What remained was something raw and vulnerable that none of them had seen before. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a former Army Special Forces medic. I served 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2015 and 2019. I was awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart before I was medically discharged following a mission that went very, very wrong. The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus could see the shock registering on each face as the implications of her revelation sank in. This woman they had trusted with their deepest traumas, who had guided them through their darkest moments, was one of them in a way they had never imagined. 6 years ago, I was part of a 12-person team conducting a rescue mission in Kandahar province. We were extracting a high-value intelligence asset who had been compromised. The mission was supposed to be routine. She paused, her hands clenched at her sides. Intelligence was wrong. We walked into a coordinated ambush by over 40 Taliban fighters. Staff Sergeant Park leaned forward in his chair. How many made it out? Just me. The weight of those 2 words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Marcus felt his own chest tighten as memories of Jenkins and Thompson flashed through his mind. Losing 2 teammates had nearly destroyed him. He could not imagine surviving when 11 others did not. I spent the next 18 hours pinned down in a bombed-out building, treating my own wounds and those of 3 teammates who were still alive but critically injured. I used every piece of medical training I had, but one by one they died. The last one, Corporal Danny Reeves, held on for 16 hours. He was 22 years old and kept asking me to tell his mother he loved her. Dr. Mitchell's voice began to break, but she continued. When the rescue team finally reached us, I was found sitting in a pool of blood, both my own and theirs completely silent. I didn't speak for 3 weeks after they pulled me out of there. Sergeant Torres whispered, Jesus. The silence wasn't because of physical trauma, she continued. My throat wasn't damaged, my brain wasn't injured. I just couldn't find words for what had happened. How do you explain to people that you tried everything you knew to save your team? But it wasn't enough. How do you tell someone that you listened to 11 people die while you helplessly watched? Marcus understood now why she had been so effective at helping them process their own guilt and trauma. She had not just studied these feelings in textbooks. She had lived them, breathed them, nearly been destroyed by them. The Army tried everything. Speech therapists, psychiatrists, medications. Nothing worked. I was trapped inside my own mind, replaying those 18 hours over and over again. Every medical technique I should have tried differently. Every tactical decision that might have changed the outcome. I wanted to die, but I couldn't even articulate that desire. The room remained silent, but Marcus could see that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The other members were no longer looking at Dr. Mitchell as their therapist. They were seeing her as a fellow survivor, who had somehow found her way through the darkness they were still navigating. What changed? Asked Staff Sergeant Kim, a Marine who had rarely spoken in previous sessions. I met another veteran in the psychiatric ward, a Vietnam War medic named Frank, who had been struggling with his own demons for 40 years. Frank didn't try to counsel me or analyze me. He just sat with me every day and told me stories about his squad, about the men he had tried to save and the ones he couldn't. He talked for both of us until I finally found my voice again. Dr. Mitchell returned to her chair, but she remained standing. Frank taught me that sometimes the only way through trauma is to walk alongside someone else who understands it. He helped me realize that my survival wasn't a betrayal of my fallen teammates, but a responsibility to honor their memory by living purposefully. Is that why you became a therapist? Marcus asked. Yes. Frank saved my life by sharing his own story and showing me that healing was possible. I wanted to do the same for other warriors who were lost in their own darkness. But I've never told any group about my background because I was afraid you would see me as damaged goods rather than someone qualified to help. Sergeant Torres shook his head slowly. Ma'am, with all due respect, it's exactly the opposite. Knowing what you've been through, what you've survived, it makes everything you've told us more meaningful, not less. You've been where we are, added Staff Sergeant Park. You understand the weight of survivor guilt because you've carried it yourself. That's not a weakness in a therapist. It's the greatest strength you could possibly have. Dr. Mitchell finally sat down, and for the first time in months, Marcus saw her shoulders relax slightly. The burden of carrying her secret while trying to help them heal had been enormous, and releasing it seemed to lift a weight that had been pressing down on her. There's more, she said quietly. The reason I went silent for 3 weeks wasn't just grief or trauma. It was because I had made a promise to Danny Reeves as he was dying. He asked me to tell his mother that he loved her, but he also made me promise something else. He made me promise that if I survived, I would find a way to help other soldiers who were struggling. He said his death had to mean something. Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time since the explosion. The idea that Dr. Mitchell's entire career was built on a promise to a dying soldier, that every session she conducted was an attempt to fulfill that sacred obligation, gave new depth to everything she had done for them. So every time I help one of you process your trauma, every time someone in this group takes a step toward healing, I'm honoring Danny's memory and the memories of all 11 teammates I lost that day. You're not just healing for yourselves. You're helping me fulfill a promise I made to a dying soldier 6 years ago. The revelation reframed everything. Suddenly, their own healing journeys were connected to something larger than themselves. They were part of a chain of healing that stretched back to that bombed-out building in Kandahar province, and forward to every veteran who might benefit from Dr. Mitchell's work. Why now? Asked Staff Sergeant Kim. Why tell us tonight? Dr. Mitchell looked at Marcus. Because Chief Rodriguez helped me realize that I was asking all of you to be vulnerable and honest, while I was holding back the most important part of my own story. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't authentic. The session ran over its scheduled time as the group processed this new information. The questions came slowly at first, then more rapidly as the participants began to see Dr. Mitchell in an entirely new light. She answered each one with the same honesty and vulnerability she had always encouraged from them. As they finally prepared to leave, Marcus approached her one last time. How do you feel? He asked, terrified, she admitted, but also relieved. I've been carrying that secret for 8 months and it was getting heavier every session. You know what this means, don't you? What? It means you're not just our therapist anymore. You're one of us, and that makes this group stronger, not weaker. Dr. Mitchell smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, it reached all the way to her eyes. The group dynamic changed overnight. What had been a traditional therapy session with clear boundaries between doctor and patients evolved into something more complex and powerful. Dr. Mitchell's revelation had shattered the artificial barrier that separated her from the men she was treating, creating a space where healing could happen more authentically. In the weeks that followed, the conversations deepened. Where before the participants had shared their stories with careful reserve, knowing they were speaking to someone who had never walked in their boots, now there was a raw honesty that cut straight to the heart of their shared experience. The hardest part isn't the nightmares, Sergeant Torres said during a particularly intense session. It's the moments when I forget, when I wake up and for just a split second everything's normal. Then reality comes crashing back and I have to remember all over again that Rodriguez and Martinez didn't make it home. Dr. Mitchell nodded with an understanding that went beyond professional training. I know exactly what you mean. For months after Kandahar, I would wake up and instinctively reach for my medical bag to check on my team. The realization that they were gone felt fresh every single morning. Marcus watched this exchange with fascination. The vulnerability was mutual now, creating a feedback loop of healing that seemed to benefit everyone involved. Dr. Mitchell was not just facilitating their recovery, she was actively participating in it. But the change also brought new challenges. During one session, Staff Sergeant Park broke down completely while describing the helicopter crash that had left him burned and scarred. As his sobs filled the room, Dr. Mitchell moved from her chair to kneel beside him, offering the kind of physical comfort that crossed professional boundaries but felt completely natural in the context of their shared warrior bond. "I can still smell the fuel burning," Park gasped through his tears. "I can still hear Rodriguez screaming. Why couldn't I save him? Why couldn't I pull him out?" "Because sometimes the situation is bigger than our ability to control it, Doctor," Mitchell said softly, her hand on his shoulder. "Because sometimes people die despite our best efforts, and the only choice we have is how we honor their memory moving forward." Marcus recognized the words as ones she had probably told herself countless times during her own dark nights. The professional distance that had once defined her interactions was gone, replaced by the fierce loyalty that warriors showed to each other in the aftermath of battle. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself making progress he had not thought possible. The nightmares became less frequent, and when they did come, he had tools for processing them that went beyond simple endurance. More importantly, he had a community of people who understood what those nightmares meant, without explanation. But it was Dr. Mitchell's own continued healing that proved most inspiring. During one session, she shared a breakthrough she had experienced the previous week. "I've been carrying Danny Reeves's dog tags for 6 years, she said, pulling a worn set of tags from beneath her shirt. "I told myself I was keeping them to honor his memory, but really I was holding on to them because I felt guilty about surviving when he didn't. This week I finally realized that he wouldn't want me to carry that guilt forever." She looked around the circle at each member of the group. "Watching all of you choose to heal, seeing you fight your way back from the darkness. It's shown me that survival can be its own form of service. Every day we choose to live fully, we're proving that our fallen teammates' sacrifices meant something." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of a knot that had been there since the explosion. "What are you going to do with the tags?" "I'm going to visit Danny's mother. She lives about 2 hours from here. I'm going to deliver the message he asked me to give her 6 years ago, and I'm going to return his tags to where they belong." The room was quiet as everyone processed the significance of that decision. Dr. Mitchell was choosing to complete a mission that had been interrupted by trauma, reclaiming agency over a story that had been defined by loss for too long. "Would you like company?" Marcus heard himself ask. "I mean, if you want to go alone, I understand, but if you'd like backup." Dr. Mitchell's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" "We all would," said Sergeant Torres, speaking for the group. "That's what teams do. We've got each other's backs." 3 days later, Marcus found himself in Dr. Mitchell's car, driving through the Virginia countryside toward a small town where Mrs. Danny Reeves had been waiting 6 years for closure she didn't even know was coming. The rest of the group had wanted to come, but they had agreed that a smaller delegation would be less overwhelming for Danny's mother. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked as they pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story house with a well-maintained garden. "Terrified," Dr. Mitchell admitted. "What if she blames me? What if she asks why I survived when he didn't? Then we'll deal with it together. But I don't think that's what's going to happen." Mrs. Reeves was a woman in her early 60s with graying hair and her son's gentle eyes. When Dr. Mitchell introduced herself and explained why she had come, the older woman's composure crumbled. "I've wondered for 6 years what his last moments were like," she said through her tears. "The Army told me he died serving his country, but I needed to know if he suffered, if he was afraid." Dr. Mitchell pulled out Danny's dog tags and placed them in his mother's hands. "He wasn't afraid, Mrs. Reeves. He was brave and calm, and he spent his last hours trying to take care of the rest of the team. He asked me to tell you that he loved you more than anything in the world." "Did he? Did he know he was dying, Doctor?" Mitchell hesitated for only a moment. "Yes, ma'am. But he faced it like the warrior he was. He was proud to serve, and he was proud to be your son." They spent 2 hours with Mrs. Reeves, sharing stories about Danny and helping her piece together the final chapter of his life. When they left, Marcus could see that something fundamental had shifted in Dr. Mitchell's bearing. A weight that had been pressing down on her for 6 years had finally been lifted. "How do you feel?" he asked as they drove away. "Complete," she said simply. For the first time since that day in Kandahar, I feel like I've fulfilled my duty to my team." The drive back to base was quiet, both of them processing what they had just experienced. Marcus realized that witnessing Dr. Mitchell's moment of closure had helped him understand something crucial about his own healing journey. Recovery was not about forgetting the fallen or moving past the trauma. It was about finding ways to carry those experiences that honored the dead while allowing the living to move forward with purpose. That night, for the first time since the explosion, Marcus slept without nightmares. He dreamed instead of Jenkins and Thompson as they had been in life, laughing and telling stories, and when he woke, the memory brought comfort rather than pain. The next group session was different from any that had come before. Dr. Mitchell shared details of her visit with Mrs. Reeves, and something in her voice had changed. The haunted quality that had always lurked beneath her professional demeanor was gone, replaced by a peace that seemed to radiate outward. "Completing that mission taught me something important," she told the group. "We honor our fallen not by carrying their deaths as punishment, but by choosing to live in a way that gives meaning to their sacrifice." Marcus looked around the circle and saw that same realization dawning on faces that had been marked by guilt and survivors' remorse. They were warriors, all of them, and warriors completed their missions. Sometimes that mission was as simple as choosing to heal, to live, to find purpose in their survival. The transformation was not complete, but it had begun in earnest. And, for the first time since the explosion, Marcus believed it was actually possible. 6 months after that first group session, Marcus stood in front of his commanding officer's desk, waiting for the verdict that would determine the next phase of his life. His physical recovery had exceeded all expectations. The leg that doctors had worried might end his military career was now stronger than it had been before the explosion. But the real question was whether he was mentally and emotionally ready to return to active duty. "Your psychological evaluations have been outstanding," Chief Rodriguez, Commander Hayes said, reviewing the thick file spread across his desk. "Dr. Chen reports that you've made remarkable progress in processing your combat trauma. Dr. Mitchell's group therapy assessment is equally positive." Marcus nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral despite the nervousness churning in his stomach. "Thank you, sir. However," Commander Hayes continued, "there's something unusual about your case. Dr. Mitchell has submitted a special recommendation that I've never seen before in 15 years of reviewing fitness for duty assessments." Marcus felt his heart rate spike. Had Dr. Mitchell discovered something in their sessions that would disqualify him from returning to his team? Had his vulnerability in group therapy somehow been interpreted as a weakness that would make him unreliable in combat? "She's recommending that you be assigned to a new program the Navy is developing," Commander Hayes said. "It's a pilot initiative for integrating psychological support specialists into special operations teams. Essentially, we're looking for experienced operators who also have advanced training in trauma counseling to serve as embedded mental health advocates." Marcus blinked in surprise. "Sir, I don't have any training in psychology. Not yet. But Dr. Mitchell believes you have a natural aptitude for it, and she's volunteering to oversee your education. The program would involve 18 months of intensive study, while you maintain your SEAL qualifications, followed by assignment to teams that are deploying to high-stress environments." Commander Hayes leaned back in his chair. "The idea is that having someone who's been through combat trauma themselves, someone the operators trust as a fellow warrior, might be more effective at identifying and addressing psychological issues before they become serious problems." Marcus thought about his experience in the group therapy sessions, how Dr. Mitchell's revelation about her own military service had transformed the entire dynamic. The idea made perfect sense. Warriors were more likely to open up to someone who had carried a rifle alongside them than to a civilian therapist who had never faced enemy fire. "What would my role be exactly, sir?" "You would remain a fully qualified SEAL, participating in all missions and operations. But you would also be trained to recognize signs of psychological distress in your teammates and to provide immediate intervention when necessary. Think of it as being a medic for the mind instead of the body." The concept was intriguing, but Marcus had questions. Would this affect my career progression? Would I still be eligible for team leadership positions? Actually, the Navy is hoping this specialization will enhance career opportunities. We're looking at eventually having psychological support specialists at every level of special operations, from team level up to command positions. You would be part of the first generation to pioneer this approach. Marcus thought about the men in his therapy group, each of them struggling with demons that might have been addressed earlier if someone had been watching for the warning signs. He thought about Jenkins and Thompson, both of whom had shown subtle signs of stress in the weeks before the explosion that he had missed or dismissed. "Sir, I'd like to accept the program, but I have one condition." Commander Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Chief, you're not really in a position to make demands." "It's not a demand, sir. It's a request. I'd like the other members of my therapy group to be considered for similar programs if they're interested. We've been healing together and I think we could serve together in new ways." "That's an interesting idea. I'll discuss it with Dr. Mitchell and see what she thinks." 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself sitting in a graduate-level psychology course at the local university, surrounded by civilian students half his age who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and intimidation. His classmates struggled to reconcile his obvious military bearing with his presence in a curriculum focused on trauma, counseling, and therapeutic intervention. Dr. Mitchell had arranged for his coursework to be accelerated and specialized, focusing on combat psychology, group dynamics, and crisis intervention rather than the broader psychology curriculum. 3 evenings a week she tutored him privately, helping him understand how the therapeutic techniques he had experienced as a patient could be applied in his future role. "The key difference between traditional therapy and what you'll be doing," she explained during one of their sessions, "is that you'll be working with active operators in high-stress environments. You won't have the luxury of a controlled clinical setting. You'll need to be able to provide effective intervention in the field, sometimes under fire." Marcus was discovering that he had an intuitive grasp of human psychology that had been honed by years of reading people in life or death situations. The skills that had made him an effective SEAL, his ability to assess and respond to human behavior under extreme stress, translated surprisingly well to therapeutic intervention. But the real breakthrough came when the other members of his therapy group began joining similar programs. Sergeant Torres was accepted into a Marine Corps initiative focused on peer counseling for combat amputees. Staff Sergeant Park began training as a burn recovery specialist. One by one, the men who had been broken by their experiences were finding ways to transform their trauma into service. "You know what I realized?" Dr. Mitchell said during one of their study sessions. "We've created something that goes beyond traditional therapy. You've all become wounded healers, people who can guide others through darkness because you've navigated it yourselves." Marcus looked up from the textbook he was studying. "Is that what you are? A wounded healer?" "I think so. I think that's what all of us are becoming." The group therapy sessions continued, but their nature evolved as the participants began developing their own therapeutic skills. What had started as a support group for traumatized veterans was becoming a training ground for a new generation of military mental health specialists. During one particularly powerful session, Staff Sergeant Kim, who had barely spoken during his first months in the group, shared a story about helping a younger Marine process his fear before a dangerous mission. "I used techniques Dr. Mitchell taught us," Kim said. "I helped him understand that fear is information, not a weakness." By the end of our conversation, he was calm and focused instead of panicked. Marcus watched Dr. Mitchell's face light up with pride as she listened to Kim's account. Her vision of warriors helping warriors heal was becoming reality, and the ripple effects were already spreading beyond their small group. "The beautiful thing about what you're all doing," she told them, "is that you're proving that healing is not a destination but a way of traveling. Every person you help process their trauma, every intervention that prevents a psychological casualty, every moment when you choose connection over isolation, you're continuing your own healing journey while helping someone else begin theirs." As Marcus walked back to his quarters that night, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in less than a year. The explosion that had shattered his sense of identity and purpose had somehow led him to discover a calling that felt deeper and more meaningful than anything he had done before. He was still a warrior, but his battlefield had expanded. He was learning to fight an enemy that was invisible, but no less deadly than any insurgent force. PTSD, depression, survivor guilt, and the epidemic of veteran suicide were claiming more casualties than any foreign adversary, and Marcus was training to be part of the solution. The next phase of his journey was about to begin, and for the first time since the explosion, Marcus felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He was no longer just surviving his trauma. He was transforming it into something that could help save other warriors who were still lost in their own darkness. The boy who had enlisted to serve his country was becoming a man whose service would extend far beyond any single mission or deployment. His greatest battles still lay ahead, but now he knew he would not be fighting them alone. 2 years later, Marcus stood on the deck of an aircraft carrier cutting through the Pacific swells, watching a team of young SEALs prepare for their first combat deployment. As the Navy's first embedded psychological support specialist, he was heading into uncharted territory, but he was not traveling alone. The program that had started with his therapy group had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The Department of Defense had fast-tracked the initiative after early results showed a dramatic reduction in psychological casualties among units that included trained peer counselors. What had begun as an experimental program was now being implemented across all branches of special operations. Dr. Mitchell had been promoted to Director of Combat Psychology Integration and was overseeing similar programs for the Army, Marines, and Air Force. But it was the success of Marcus and his fellow wounded healers that had proved the concept and paved the way for widespread adoption. "Chief Rodriguez?" A young petty officer approached him nervously. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but could I talk to you about something?" Marcus recognized the look in the young man's eyes immediately. It was the same haunted expression he had worn after the explosion, the same lost quality that had marked every member of his therapy group when they first arrived. "What's your name, sailor?" "Petty Officer Jackson, sir. I'm with Team 7. "What's on your mind, Jackson?" Jackson glanced around the deck to make sure they were alone. "I've been having some problems, sir. Since our last deployment, I'm not sleeping well, and I keep having these episodes where I can't breathe properly." Marcus nodded, recognizing the classic symptoms of combat stress. 2 years ago, he might have told Jackson to tough it out, to push through the weakness. Now he understood that early intervention could prevent a minor issue from becoming a career-ending problem. "How long has this been going on?" "About 3 months, sir. Since we lost Martinez in that firefight outside Mosul." "Were you and Martinez close?" Jackson's composure cracked slightly. "He was my swim buddy through Bud S. We've been on the same team for 2 years. I was supposed to be covering his 6, but I was distracted by movement in a building to our left. The sniper shot came from the right." Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest as he recognized his own story reflected in Jackson's words. The guilt, the second-guessing, the crushing weight of responsibility for a teammate's death. Without the intervention of Dr. Mitchell and the therapy group, Marcus knew he would still be carrying that burden alone. "Jackson, I want to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. Martinez's death was not your fault. You were doing exactly what you were trained to do by checking potential threats. The sniper who killed him is responsible for his death, not you. But if I had been watching the right direction, then you might have missed the threat on the left, and someone else might have died. This is war, Jackson. We can't control every variable, and we can't save everyone no matter how much we want to." Marcus guided Jackson to a quiet corner of the deck where they could talk privately. Over the next hour, he used every technique Dr. Mitchell had taught him to help the young SEAL begin processing his grief and guilt in healthy ways. "Sir, how do you know all this stuff?" Jackson asked as their conversation wound down. Marcus smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought him to this moment. "Because 3 years ago I was sitting exactly where you are now. I lost 2 teammates in an IED blast and I was convinced it was my fault. I spent months drowning in guilt and nightmares until I learned that healing is possible, but only if you're willing to accept help." Jackson looked surprised. "You went through this too?" "Every warrior who serves in combat long enough will face something like this. The difference is whether we face it alone or whether we face it together." That evening, Marcus ran a group session for Team 7 in the carrier's conference room. Jackson attended along with 5 other team members who were struggling with various combat stress issues. As he looked around the circle at their young faces, Marcus was struck by how similar they looked to his original therapy group, marked by the same combination of physical toughness and emotional vulnerability that defined warriors who had seen too much. But there was one crucial difference. These men were receiving help before their problems became overwhelming. They were learning coping strategies while they were still functional, still connected to their teams, still able to process their experiences in healthy ways. The most important thing to understand, Marcus told the group, is that what you're feeling is normal. Combat trauma is not a sign of weakness. It's proof that you're human. The strongest warriors are the ones who recognize when they need support and are brave enough to ask for it. Over the following weeks, as the carrier moved toward its deployment area, Marcus worked with individual team members and ran regular group sessions. He watched young SEALs who had been struggling with nightmares and anxiety begin to find their footing again. He saw teammates learn to support each other in ways that went beyond traditional military camaraderie. The real test came during their first major operation, a complex hostage rescue in a hostile urban environment. Marcus accompanied the teams as both a SEAL and a psychological support specialist, ready to provide immediate intervention if anyone showed signs of acute stress reaction. The mission went smoothly until the extraction phase, when they took sniper fire from multiple positions. In the chaos that followed, one of the younger SEALs, Petty Officer Chen, froze completely, unable to move or respond to commands. Under the old model, Chen would have been written off as a combat failure and likely removed from the teams. Instead, Marcus was able to provide immediate intervention, using breathing techniques and grounding exercises to help Chen regain his composure and complete the mission. Later, during the debrief, Marcus worked with Chen to process what had happened and develop strategies for preventing similar episodes in the future. What could have been a career-ending psychological casualty was transformed into a learning experience that made Chen stronger and more resilient. "You know what I realized during that mission?" Dr. Mitchell said during one of their regular video conferences. "We're not just preventing psychological casualties anymore. We're creating more resilient warriors who are better prepared to handle the stresses of combat." Marcus nodded, thinking about the changes he had observed in the teams he worked with. "It's like we're vaccinating them against trauma before they're exposed to it." Exactly. And the beautiful thing is that it's sustainable. Every warrior you train in these techniques becomes someone who can help their teammates. We're creating a culture of psychological resilience that will perpetuate itself. As his deployment progressed, Marcus found himself taking on an even broader role. He was consulting with team leaders about how to recognize stress in their subordinates, training junior NCOs in basic intervention techniques, and helping design new protocols for psychological screening and support. But the most rewarding moments came during the quiet conversations with individual warriors who were struggling with the weight of their experiences. In those moments, Marcus was not just applying clinical techniques. He was sharing the wisdom that had been hard-won through his own journey from trauma to healing. "The thing about being a warrior," he told Petty Officer Jackson during one of their sessions, "is that we're trained to never surrender, to always keep fighting. The hardest lesson to learn is that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is surrender to the healing process and allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to accept help." Jackson had made remarkable progress over the course of the deployment. The nightmares were less frequent, the breathing episodes had stopped, and most importantly, he was reconnecting with his sense of purpose and identity as a SEAL. "Chief, can I ask you something?" Jackson said during their final session before returning home. "Of course. When you were going through this, did you ever think you'd be able to help other people the way you've helped me?" Marcus thought back to those dark days after the explosion, when he had questioned whether he would ever feel whole again. "Honestly? No. I was so lost in my own pain that I couldn't imagine ever being useful to anyone again. But that's the amazing thing about healing. It doesn't just restore who we were. It can transform us into something we never imagined we could become." As the carrier headed home, Marcus stood once again on the deck, watching the ocean scroll past. The young SEAL who had deployed was returning as someone fundamentally different, not because he had been broken and repaired, but because he had discovered a calling that gave deeper meaning to his service. The program that had started with a small group of traumatized veterans had become a revolution in how the military approached psychological resilience. Thousands of warriors were now receiving help before they reached the breaking point, and the culture of silence that had allowed so many to suffer alone was giving way to a new understanding that seeking support was a sign of strength, not weakness. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to a message from Dr. Mitchell that had arrived that morning. "The latest statistics are incredible," she had written. "Suicide rates among special operations personnel have dropped by 40% in units with embedded psychological support specialists. You and the others are